Hey everyone. So, as promised, here's a video about voter behavior in presidential elections. So, we're going to focus primarily on the time for change model. Political scientists really like creating models to try to predict behavior, and this time for change model works pretty well. What it basically says is that there are three things that influence whether a presidential candidate will win: incumbency, which I'll explain in a minute, approval ratings, and economic conditions. So what we do is to plug those in, focus on approval ratings and economic conditions first. We look at the approval rating of the current president, whoever that is, whether they're running or not, and the economic conditions, which in this case is third quarter GDP growth. Now, that is it. Those two factors, notice they don't consider who's actually running. They just consider the current president and the current economic conditions. Now, there's a third factor, right? Incumbency, like I said. And that's where the time for change model becomes really important, because it makes a prediction. It basically says that incumbent parties usually get a second term, but not a third term. So what does that mean? Well, we know that presidents currently are constitutionally limited to serving 2 terms only. So currently, Biden is our incumbent president, right? He is the current president. That means he's the incumbent. So Biden, as the incumbent president, is going to run presumably in 2024. Maybe he won't, but let's assume he does. The time for change model would say that he will be likely to get reelected, assuming his approval ratings are decent and economic conditions are decent, right? Those two things might mess it up for him. But that third element in the equation gives him a little boost because he's running for a second term. And that gives him a boost. And that kind of makes sense, right? We know that in Congress, there's an incumbency advantage. And even though it's a little bit different in the White House, it's still an advantage, right? Because we know who they are. We've already voted for them once. So it's like, well, gosh, I voted for, this candidate 4 years ago. I guess maybe I should keep voting for them, right? We tend to not like cognitive dissonance, and voting against the person we voted for in the past is sort of a weird thing to do. So maybe we've reached our affective tipping point, right? Maybe we don't like them anymore, but that's pretty unlikely. So incumbents have that advantage of getting people who already voted for them once to vote for them again. But also incumbents have another advantage. People who may not have known about them are going to have seen them for 4 years, and now they know something. And maybe people who voted against them are like, well, actually, the country's been pretty good for the last 4 years. I guess I can change my mind. And it's not like they're voting against the person they voted for last time, right? It's not like the person who they voted for last time is running again, typically. So that gives the incumbent president pretty good advantage. And that's what the model does. It gives them sort of a little bonus, a boost, if they're running for a second term. But if they're running for a third term, it takes off a little. Now, obviously, we know Biden can't run for a third term, right? If he runs and wins in 2024, in 2028, he will not be able to run. He'll have served 2 terms. He'll be term limited. But let's say Kamala Harris, as his vice president, runs in his stead, right? Another Democrat. So that means that the incumbent party, the Democrats, will be running for a third term. She will be unlikely to win that, no matter how high Biden's approval ratings or how strong the economic conditions are, right? Because she's running for a third term for the Democrats, the incumbent party, she's going to have a pretty big minus in that column. That doesn't mean she will automatically lose, right? The time for change model doesn't say the incumbent party will never get a third term. It's just they don't usually. We know that George H.W. Bush got a third term for the Republicans after 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, right? But he didn't get a 4th term. And I've said that that's partially because his campaign was not great, right? He wasn't necessarily the most savvy campaigner, whereas Clinton ran a very savvy campaign. However, running for a fourth term for your party is really tough, right? And if the time for change model says generally the public wants change by the third term, by the fourth term, we were probably fed up with the Republicans. So in 2016, when Clinton won the popular vote, even though she did not win the Electoral College vote, that's actually a pretty big surprise, right? Because she was on track to win a third term for the Democrats, which isn't common. Now, again, she didn't win the Electoral College, and we saw there was change, right? And obviously, even though she did win the popular vote, she didn't win it by a wide enough margin in the right states, or win it by, I guess, just in the right states, really, to flip the Electoral College vote. So again, enough people seem to want change. So that's the time for change model in a nutshell. Third term incumbent parties just typically struggle. Second term incumbents, though, usually do pretty well. So we would have expected Clinton in 2016 to do badly. We would have expected Trump in 2020 to do well. Now, obviously, both those were somewhat wrong as predictions go. Clinton, again, did win the Electoral College vote. Trump did lose. But Clinton won with a very small margin and lost the Electoral College vote. And Trump didn't lose by as large of a margin as some people predicted. And also, we know that Trump was very unpopular, right? His approval ratings were low, and because of the pandemic, the economic conditions were bad. So those two factors seem to have counteracted his incumbency. Now, there is another way people vote, right? We don't actually think, oh, it's time for a change. I'm going to think about the current approval ratings and economic conditions and how many terms a party has served and come up with my vote that way, right? That's not how voters actually behave. The time for change model models how voters behave, but we know that it's not actually what voters do. Voters typically will vote retrospectively, right? Voting on past performance. That's why approval ratings are important, right? If we approve of a president, we're more likely to keep supporting them or their party because we think that they've done well in the past, right? That's why we've approved of them in the past. Same with economic conditions, right? If the economy is going well, that means, to us at least, that the president has been doing a good job. So looking back, they've done a good job. They've made the economy strong. So we should keep voting for them or for their party, right? Now, what's important is, as in the model, we're only looking at current conditions. Past performance, but only as it affects life as you're thinking about it. So what have you done for me today? Not what have you done for me for the past 4 years, right? So that's why the economic conditions now matter, but not the economic conditions a year ago. And by now, I mean at the time of the election. Now, of course, most people actually do just vote on party line. I don't know if you remember when Mitt Romney was running, there was this sort of big controversy, this gaffe about the 47% who will never vote for him. And he was rather condescending about this 47%. But what's funny is he's actually not wrong that about 47% of voters would never vote for him, because we see that out of sort of your likely voters, 47 to 48% will pretty much always vote Democrat, and 47 to 48% will pretty much always vote Republican. So we only have about 4 to 6% in the middle who are actually swaying back and forth, what are called swing voters, right, who go back and forth. So Romney may have been wrong about who these 47% were and why they would always vote for a Democrat, but he was right that about 47% of voters were always going to be voting for a Democrat. Again, on the flip side, he was always going to have support of about 47, a different 47%, right, of voters who would always vote for Republican. We tend to vote on party line. We might switch based on our retrospective views of the candidates, but it is pretty rare. It's just that middle swing voters, that's like sort of 4 to 6% who are undecided, who might not have a strong party affiliation, might only vote in presidential elections. They're the ones who are swinging back and forth depending on things like how many terms the incumbent has had, how much they like the past president, the incumbent president, right? And how the economic conditions are. And on the margins, people may actually vote for or against a candidate, right? Approval ratings is always the current president, not approval ratings of the candidates. So when the current president is running, that means approval ratings are in some way approximating votes for or against that candidate. But say in 2016, the approval ratings were Obama's, but it was Trump and Clinton running. So in that case, we're not really factoring in candidates. And we know that candidates make a difference, right? Trump seemed to make a difference, as did Clinton. Maybe if the Democrats had run someone who's a little bit more popular, they wouldn't have just won the electoral vote. The popular vote, they would have also won the electoral vote. Maybe if Republicans had run someone who was more popular, they would have won both the electoral college vote as they did and the popular vote, right? And we know that Clinton and Trump were both extremely unpopular. But if we have maybe a matchup between a really popular president and a really unpopular one, say H.W. Bush and Dukakis, when H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president, that can sometimes possibly sway things on the margins. Of course, at that time, even though H.W. did get a third term, we know Reagan's approval ratings were relatively high and economic conditions were good. So it may have really been a reflection on that sort of overwhelmed the third term subtraction. Or it may have been people just really didn't like Dukakis very much. But that was only on the margins, right? Most of the voting would have been party line voting or voting based on sort of retrospective views of approval of the current president and economic conditions. So that's sort of how we as voters behave in presidential elections.